Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll continue my conversation about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We are, as you might be aware, in Chapter 3, and in the previous lecture I had covered up to page 108. And today I hope to cover from page 109 to 112. Now, if you recall, or if you have rewatched the previous video, in this chapter, Freire is finally developing a praxis of the dialogical mode of education, or the problem-posing education. He started the chapter by discussing what a dialogue is, teaching us how the dialogic mode of education is important. Then he also discusses about the existence of human beings, that we always exist in a material situation, and each material situation has what he calls a thematic universe. And the point is that in order to deliver any kind of education or didactics, we need to first understand the lived conditions of the people. That means deciphering the thematic universe in which they exist. What are the limitations there, and what are the possibilities, right? And that we cannot learn top-down. We have to learn it through an active engagement of the people themselves. Now, in today's discussion, what we'll read and talk about, he starts articulating how to go about developing a sort of a curriculum that is liberatory and dialogic, and what steps should an investigator or a pedagogue follow in a given community. So as always, I'll first read and then come back and talk about it, and then towards the end I'll conclude our today's discussion. So here we go. As being in a situation find themselves rooted in temporal spatial conditions which mark them and which they also mark, they will tend to reflect on their own situationality to the extent that they are challenged by it to act upon it. Human beings are because they are in a situation, and they will be more the more they not only critically reflect upon their existence, but critically act upon it. Reflection about situationality is reflection about the very condition of existence. Critical thinking by means of which people discover each other to be in a situation. Only as this situation ceases to present itself as a dense, enveloping reality or a tormenting blind alley, and they can come to perceive it as an objective problematic situation, only then can commitment exist. Humankind emerge from their submersion and acquire the ability to intervene in reality as it is unveiled. Intervention in reality, historical awareness of itself, thus represents a step forward from emergence and results from the conscientiaco of the situation. Conscientiaco is the deepening of the attitude of awareness characteristic of all emergence. Every thematic investigation which deepens historical awareness is thus really educational. While all authentic education investigates thinking, the more educators and the people investigate the people's thinking and are thus jointly educated, the more they continue to investigate. Education and thematic investigation in the problem-posing concept of education are simply different moments of the same process. In contrast with the anti-dialogical and non-communicative deposits of the banking method of education, the program content of the problem-posing method, dialogical par excellence, is constituted and organized by the student's view of the world, where their own generative themes are found. The content thus constantly expands and renews itself. The task of the dialogical teacher in an interdisciplinary team working on the thematic universe revealed by their investigation is to represent that universe to the people from whom she or he first received it, and represent it not as a lecture but as a problem. Let us say, for example, that a group has the responsibility of coordinating a plan for adult education in a peasant area with a high percentage of illiteracy. The plan includes literacy campaign and a post-literacy phase. During the former stage, problem-posing education seeks out and investigates the generative word. In the post-literary stage, it seeks out and investigates the generative theme. So as I mentioned earlier, towards the end of chapter 3, we are now moving into the actual praxis of developing a dialogical mode of education, right? And Freire is now outlining for us a sort of a method which has different stages. So at the heart of this methodology on the part of the investigators is to acknowledge one thing, right? That people live in material conditions. Their existence is situational, right? Because only in a given situation can there be a thematic universe in which people exist, right? Understanding that thematic universe is crucial in developing a praxis of pedagogy. But that understanding cannot be brought in by the investigator. That understanding must depend on the reflection of the people themselves, right? And only then they would emerge from a given thematic universe and learn to think about it critically. So the role of the investigator is to enter any given scenario. He gives you the example of adult literacy for peasants, but not come in with a plan or a solution, but rather first study the thematic universe itself. How to study it is by engaging with the people, right? By incorporating them within your project of studying a given area, by asking their opinions, by incorporating their own ways of expressing their life, thinking about it, right? That is the beginning point. And that is what he calls the intervention in reality. Intervention in a way in which the people themselves participate in thinking about their own lived conditions along with the investigator. And then the role of the investigator is to gather all that information and then represent it with the consent of the people, right? So that they can look at their own reality objectively, right? That is the process that he is articulating in this part of the chapter. One important aspect of emergence from any given thematic universe is the historical awareness, right? And that would come to be when the investigator and the people sit together, right? And talk about their given life, but also then start thinking about how did it emerge? How did they experience it? Their parents experience it, right? So the idea is to move people to think about their own lived conditions and lived situation, and to start thinking that the universe, the thematic universe that they are a part of, is not natural. It's not divinely ordained, but a human construct, right? But you can either lecture them about it, which is absolutely wrong, or have a conversation in which they share their own experiences and they learn to think about their own life critically. And that is the point that he is trying to make in these lines. And so when they think about it, when people think about their own life, they are not looking at it as natural, but it becomes a problematic. It is a problem to be solved. They are poor. They don't have enough food, right? The thematic universe that they existed in could be a universe of fatalism or silence, where God has ordained it. But when they start thinking about it critically, it will make them think about how hard they work, who is helping them, who is not, who has more, who has less, right? what kind of power structure exists, and all of this conversation and reflective thinking by the people themselves would enable them to look at their own lived condition more critically. Now think of it, this is not just a book on pedagogy then. This is the question that Marxism had tried to answer, that Marx tried to answer, Lukács tried to answer, Lenin tried to answer, and that was, how would people become aware of their own exploitation? So there was the vanguardist solution, there was the solution by education by the party itself. This is on the similar lines, but it is telling us that people must be encouraged, must become participants in thinking their own reality, which of course is masked, right? Because they think of it as natural. And it is that unveiling of reality with equal participation of the people that will allow them to see their own lived conditions differently. And in the process, the investigator will learn from them, and they will learn from the investigator. So the process has to be a co-learning. And that is when he divides it, right? That a program of education will have two phases, okay? The first is the pre-literacy education phase. The second is the post-literacy education phase. The pre-literacy education phase involves a lot of research, a lot of engagement of the people, a study of the thematic universe itself within which people exist. And that is the first stage that he is going to explain first, and then move on to the second stage, right? So let us read a little more and then see what else he has to add. Here, however, consider only the investigation of the generative themes or the meaningful thematics. Once the investigators have determined the area in which they will work and have acquired a preliminary acquaintance with the area through secondary sources, they initiate the first stage of the investigation. This beginning, like any beginning in any human activity, involves difficulties and risks which are to a certain point normal, although they are not always evident in the first contact with the individuals of the area. In this first contact, the investigators need to get a significant number of persons to agree to an informal meeting during which they can talk about the objectives of their presence in the area. In this meeting, they explain the reason for the investigation, how it is to be carried out, and to what use it will be put. They further explain that the investigation will be impossible without a relation of mutual understanding and trust. If the participants agree both to the investigation and to the subsequent process, the investigators should call for volunteers among the participants to serve as assistants. These volunteers will gather a series of necessary data about the life of the area. Of even greater importance, however, is the active presence of these volunteers in the investigation. Meanwhile, the investigators begin their own visits to the area, never forcing themselves, but acting as sympathetic observers with an attitude of understanding towards what they see. While it is normal for investigators to come to the area with values which influence their perceptions, this does not mean that they may transform the thematic investigation into a means of imposing these values. The only dimension of these values which it is hoped the people whose thematics are being investigated will come to share, it is presumed that the investigators possess this quality, is a critical perception of the world, which implies a correct method of approaching reality in order to unveil it. And critical perception cannot be imposed, thus from the very beginning thematic investigation is expressed as an educational pursuit, as cultural action. During their visits, the investigators set their critical aim on the area under study as if it were for them an enormous, unique, living code to be deciphered. They regard the area as a totality and visit upon visit attempt to split it by analyzing the partial dimensions which impress them. Through this process, they expand their understanding of how the various parts interact, which will later help them penetrate the totality itself. During this decoding stage, the investigators observe certain moments of the life of the area, sometimes directly, sometimes by means of informal conversations with the inhabitants. They register everything in their notebooks, including apparently unimportant items, the way the people talk, their style of life, their behavior at church and at work. They record the idiom of the people, their expressions, their vocabulary, and their syntax. Not their incorrect pronunciation, but rather the way they construct their thought. It is essential that the investigators observe the area under varying circumstances, labor in the fields, meeting of a local association, noting the behavior of the participants, the language used, and the relation between the officers and the members, the role played by women and by young people, leisure hours, games and sports, conversations with people in their homes, noting examples of husband-wife and parent-child relationships. No activity must escape the attention of the investigators during the initial survey of the area. After each observation visit, the investigator should draw up a brief report to be discussed by the entire team in order to evaluate the preliminary findings of both the professional investigators and the local assistants. To facilitate the participation of the assistants, the evaluation meetings should be held in the area itself. Okay, so it looks like the text is pretty clear. This is the first stage of a so-called intervention, where the investigators are entering in an area to do their work of pedagogy. What they cannot come in with is their pre-constituted assumptions. They have to set them aside. They have to do their preliminary research, their work which is already there, but when they enter a territory or an area, the first and the most important part of it is that they have to meet the people, a larger group of people, not just the notables, right? And get their willing consent to work and study the area. Now that consent must also involve the investigators explaining why they are there, what do they mean to accomplish by their study, how would it be useful to the people, right? And how will it be used, right? So the entire interaction then cannot be a consultancy firm going into the Amazon to study a tribe without getting the consent of the tribe itself, without telling them what that study would do. The study must be geared towards the people themselves, right? And that they give their consent. There should be mutual trust and understanding. That's the first condition. The second philosophical condition is what he's suggesting is that the investigators must think of this area as a totality. What does he mean by it? That it has a larger thematic universe. Remember, they have to find the major thematic and then study it. Now, if they think of it as a totality, then that encourages them to study the parts of it, what constitutes it. And in order to do that, everything must be studied. The way people talk, the way they talk to each other, the way they talk about authority, the way they behave within the family circle, at work, in the fields, what are the relations of productions. Everything must be recorded, observed. But most importantly, it cannot be a top-down observation. Volunteers from the community must join the project as assistants, as co-researchers, and their information must be incorporated within the collected data of the investigators or the investigating team. So it is not someone coming from outside with their own assumptions studying an area. It's someone coming from outside, putting aside their own assumptions, getting the consent of the community and their trust, informing them what the study is about, what will it do for the people, and then studying in great detail, but with the help and active participation of the community itself. That is crucial. And then after this intensive data has been collected, and it can't just be done in one visit, the investigators must go back and study further and analyze further, because as much data, cultural and other, they collect, it will enable them to unveil the general thematic of the area, but also the sub-themes within which people exist. The people must inform the process themselves, their thinking process, their ways of explaining things, their ways of saying things must be recorded, must be a part of that investigation. And this is the first stage. We have not developed a mode of pedagogy yet. We are just trying to learn who is it that we are going to serve, what kind of a world do they live in, how do they think of that world, what constitutes that world, and that cannot be learned only by outside observers. And then towards the end of the passages that I just read, what he's saying is that, okay, researchers gather all the moving parts of this thematic universe, and then they take notes, record everything, and then they meet to discuss whatever they have collected, right? To analyze it. But in that process, the contribution of the local observers, the assistants, the volunteers must form a part of that corpus, must form a part of that data. It cannot just be the data collected by the observers. And once they've done all that, studied the totality and its parts with the information contributed by the local volunteers, they will then have a body of knowledge, a data that they can analyze and then take back to the people to share the collective understanding of the world, the lived world in which the people that you are trying to work with and serve exist. And that is the second stage, right, of this process. We will move on to the second stage in the next conversation. I'm now going to end it here. I hope this reading was useful to you. I highly recommend that you read the book and follow the lectures from the beginning. And I will now be back with the next in my series on Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Hope you're staying safe. Stay safe, take care of each other, and I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, from me to you, peace and love.